The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. With the coming of the holiday season, like many, our thoughts turn to those living in difficult circumstances. According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, since 2010, homelessness in the United States has dropped 14%. However, you would not know it from New York City, where more than 73,000 homeless people account for a 38% increase since 2007. Tonight we'll talk to a group that has done neighborhood studies of homelessness and poverty. They call them community snapshots, and we will show you what those look like in the borough of the Bronx. We'll also have a social service provider to try to get our arms around the scope of the problems and maybe even some potential solutions. If you have questions or comments about poverty and homelessness in the Bronx or in your neighborhood, send an email to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org or post them on our Facebook page, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. Okay, for the here and now, the Principal Policy Analyst for the Institute for Children, Poverty, and Homelessness, that's ICPH. It is Jennifer Erb Downward. Nice to have you with us.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. And the co-director of policy and advocacy at United Neighborhood Houses, it is Gregory Brender. Nice to have you back with us on the program.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
Ms. Erb Downward, let's talk with you about these community snapshots, which, as you know, I found fascinating. And as soon as I saw them, I said, got to have them on the show. Talk to me just background about what you did, why you did, and what you ultimately came up with.
Sure. Well, the idea behind the community snapshots was really to provide communities in New York City with local data about family and child homelessness, with the hopes that this data could be something that could be used to better understand the issue of homelessness at a community level, and also to ideally help to meet the needs of families who are experiencing homelessness.
Mm-hmm. Among the many issues that come up when we do studies of homelessness and when we do the count, and there's a count every year, and of course when the weather gets cold, is exactly tracking exactly who they are, where are they. Sometimes they don't want to respond for any number of reasons. How do you come up with data that can be reliable when you're dealing with a population that can be transient and really hard to pin down?
I think that's a great question. Well, one of the reasons that we put together these snapshots is because we really felt strongly that one point of information is not sufficient to answer that question. So in the snapshots, we looked at a number of different factors, including the number of families entering the shelter system, student homelessness by the community district. So looking at the number of students who qualified under McKinney-Vento law as being homeless. And we also then took it a little bit further to look at risk factors that families face for homelessness. So looking at aspects like rent burden, number and proportion of families living in poverty, thinking also about what the rental unit breakdown is in terms of how many rental units are needed at different income levels. So all of those factors we feel contribute to risk of homelessness in a community and are things that need to be looked at.
Can you give us, I mean, the thing is so detailed and really beautifully done, and folks, you know, we're certainly going to encourage you to go to icph.org and take a look yourself, because there's way more in there that we're going to be able to show. And really, if we don't touch on your Bronx community, you really should take a look and really understand what's going on in your neighborhood. But can you draw some large conclusion about this massive topic? And unfortunately, in the Bronx, it really is a very prevalent topic. The latest numbers show, the latest articles show that people are saying the city is not doing a good job. Homelessness is everywhere. The problem is getting worse. So what large conclusions can you determine before we get into some of the numbers?
Sure. Well, I mean, one thing that we just have to acknowledge up front is that there really is a homelessness crisis in New York City. And you see that in a number of different ways. You see that in the shelter system with over 70,000 people in shelter, and 70% of those people being parents with their children. You also see that in the school system. Over 100,000 children are homeless enrolled in the city's public and charter schools. So, and that's an increase from over 20% in the last year. So there really is a crisis that is facing the city. Then when you think about the Bronx specifically, 1/3 of all the homeless students enrolled in New York City attend schools in the Bronx.
Uh-oh. Somehow, I mean, we have so many numbers that are so difficult in the Bronx, and that we can just add to it. Today, actually, before I came in to do the show, I saw a note on TV about the New York Times Siena College poll, just about many of these same issues, and there were so many numbers that you just, oh my goodness. But I want people to think about this. 1 out of every 5 are struggling for housing and food. That's the 20% that you talked about. That is an extraordinary number. Mr. Brender, let's bring you into the dialogue. You and UNH, you deal with our neighborhoods and all over the city, but of course we're mostly concerned in the Bronx. What are the challenges for you to provide the kind of services that keep people out of homelessness? And do you get the same sense of the population that would back up the numbers that we've heard?
Yeah, I think what's really exciting about ICPH's research and Jennifer's work is this recognition that New Yorkers who are struggling are doing so in families and in communities. And so there are really a number of factors that need to be addressed. You do obviously need to keep people housed, but you also need to ensure that children have childcare, that older children have education, that education is consistent and has the kind of regularity where they're not switching schools all the time due to the transience of the family, that working adults need to often provide care for their parents. So what we really see is for families who are struggling, there are so many needs that having a crisis in one area of their life, if it's a parent who they need to provide more care for, or their children having trouble in school, all of that can lead to that one crisis that makes it harder and harder to stay housed.
Yeah. I've talked to a number of individual providers who run some of the settlement houses in the Bronx, and what tends to come up, and in a way it was the same kind of thing that was some people have said about the police department, is that we're asking you, and in other cases, let's say the police department, to clean up all the stuff we didn't do elsewhere. And I talked to one provider, and they provide an enormous amount of literal academic enrichment after school. Now, I know when I was a youngster, the only after school programs we did, we'd play basketball and go and maybe do some arts and crafts or things like that. But nowadays, you're really being left to clean up stuff that the schools don't do, some of the housing and certainly healthcare issues. I know you have, all the settlement houses have programs for referrals and education. Maybe you could characterize that for me.
Yeah, one of the challenges we face in that is that every program has its own requirements. So you need to enroll a child in childcare, get a senior into a social adult care program. You need to go through hoops often to make sure a family has everything that they need.
Would you say hoop?
You need to go through hoops. You need to,
hoops. Hoops often, okay.
And sometimes it actually takes the work of a professional case manager to track a family and say, hey, here's what's available to you, and here's how you go through the many steps of paperwork. One of the things that United Neighborhood Houses is looking at in really all the areas of social services is making it easier for families, for individuals to access services. so that there's some flexibility to say, this is what my family needs, not sort of a cookie cutter, here's X, here's Y, and here's Z, and these are the only options available to you.
You know, you talk about some of these problems. You say, well, we need more case managers. It would be so nice, or I'm thinking you need more case managers because they are the ones who really provide all these services. It would be nice to say, yes, let's get more case managers, but of course, I'm sure the many who work for you, and we know the many in the city are overburdened. All right, are you ready to take a look? Let's take a look at, and we're going to give you just a sample. This, maybe you could just explain, this was broken down by community board, right?
Sure.
Or neighborhood, really.
Yeah, really by neighborhood, so that it breaks down all 59 community boards or districts
In the Bronx, in this city.
in New York City. So
Right.
there's a profile for every neighborhood.
Sorry, we're prejudiced here about the borough of the Bronx. You know that.
We have some statistics from 3 of those profiles.
Right, which is what
tonight.
we're going to sample here. So one of the things you mentioned was this idea of students. And I mean, I looked at these numbers and I'm thinking about what it was like for myself to go to school or what it's like for any youngster to go to school. Mr. Brender already referred to the fact that they have to transfer schools. Well, this is just a sample from Community District 1 in the southernmost part of the Bronx. Jayla, if we could put that back up, what did we find from these?
So, I mean, one thing that you find is that there are an incredible
Can we
number
put that number back up? There it is, go ahead.
of homeless students who are enrolled in schools. And it's important to think about what homelessness means for students, because when we talk about homelessness, we usually think about students or families who are living in shelter. But that really is only the tip of the iceberg in New York City. 1/3 of students who are homeless live in shelter. The rest of students live in some other unstable setting, usually doubled up with a family or friend in a temporary situation. So
and that's what this 44, but let's just be clear,
Exactly.
44%, according to your study, 44% of students in Mott Haven
Yes.
are doubled up in these kind of situations that are really
Yes.
not stable, whether it's with a family, whether it's with the brother, or whether it's, you know, kind of been taken in by somebody. That's an immense number.
It is an immense number. And the thing that I think is important to point out here, if you think about the Mott Haven number, so overall across the city, it's about 2/3 of students are in a doubled up or some other situation like that.
That is just unbelievable.
Yes, 2/3 of homeless students. But in Mott Haven specifically, it's 44%. So one thing that we really wanted to highlight with these community profiles was the differences from one community to the next. Because as you know, has been mentioned in this conversation, cookie cutter solutions are not going to work.
So the
Yes.
value of that is that maybe in Mott Haven, and we're going to be taking a look at some of the other places, we're going to look at Soundview and also Highbridge, that, you know, I know Mr. Brender has the challenge of saying, well, we have a program or we have a grant to run a program, but it may not work here, or we need to emphasize something here. Let's keep going. There was another really incredible number coming out of Community District 1 in Mott Haven. Look at this, folks. This blew me away. Of course, the percentage, 9% raise over the past few years. 45% of students in Mott Haven are in homeless shelters.
So just to, yes, it's an incredible number.
Incredible.
Just to fix that just a little bit. So it's actually 45% of homeless students are in shelters. So,
Okay.
but the 1 out of every 5 students in Mott Haven has been homeless in the last
Right.
5 years.
1 out of 5.
Every 5, yes.
Oh my
So, and that's not in that profile there specifically, but thinking about the magnitude of the issue when it comes to the impact that that has on a child in terms of their development and their education. 1 out of every 5 students in a classroom in Mott Haven has been homeless in just a 5-year period.
Mr. Brender, so then we go back to you and you say, well, the schools are absolutely burdened. I mean, they're trying to teach, and then, of course, you'll get a school that maybe the numbers aren't as pretty, and then all of a sudden people are saying, why aren't you doing a better job? And then, of course, it comes to you to say, well, they really didn't get it in school. You take care of the problem. It seems rather daunting.
It is incredibly daunting, and it's one of the reasons there's such a need for flexibility. That nonprofits could look at the issues they face in their community. If, for example, they're a community school that's partnered with a public school with a high instance of children who are homeless, that they can devise solutions that really work for the families in that school, not looking just to what the city can fund, but really having a flexible funding stream that will say, this is what we've determined this family needs, basically in consultation with the very families they're serving.
So what you're suggesting is kind of people working together, certainly people who do the studies, but then also providers to work with the school and then various other branches of the community. I hesitate to ask, but I must ask, are these relationships coming together to the benefit of the people who are most in need?
I think sometimes they are, and we want to look at where they are succeeding, where there are programs that have helped people stay housed and stay stable. But there's always room for expansion. That obviously we still face a true homelessness crisis, and particularly for children.
And I also have to ask you about that funding stream. You say, well, we need flexible funding. As I understand it, you get a grant, and that grant is more specific than any of us will ever believe about what it can be applied to. Is that flexibility in place, or do you find, well, we're going to suggest or recommend somebody go to this program, but then you have to find out if they could be? I mean, it sounds like a very intricate kind of thing that the various bureaucracies and financial bureaucracies do not support.
It's true. It
Sorry,
requires
Gary, it gives them the tough questions.
It requires a work of art to take a funding stream and really ensure that what it's doing will meet the needs of the people you're serving, regardless of what they are. To say, we're not here just to say provide an after-school program, but we're here to ensure that the kids in our after-school program have the support they need. And you need programs that have some flexibility and really some richness to be able to do that.
Here's the question that I will not ask you tonight because it's not directly relevant, but I think there would be some significant concerns from the various social service communities that the federal funding streams for these kinds of programs may not be growing with the next president, but that's a whole, you can't see it, Jennifer took a really big sigh. That's another issue for another show. Are you ready to move north and west? So we're going to go
Definitely.
up to University Heights and Community District 5. So if we can take a look, this was, and by the way, we're just showing us a sample from each one of the community boards. All of the community boards have all of these different elements.
Yes.
We're just taking a snapshot of the snapshot, if you were. So what are we looking at here? This is families who enter the shelter in University Heights?
Yeah, so for every community, what we wanted to do, as I said, was to create a number of different indicators of homelessness so that you can really look at a community in a holistic way to think about what are the different risk factors. Well, one important indicator of what is going on in a community is the number of families that are entering the shelter system. So here what we see in University Heights is that there were over 400 families in 1 year that entered the shelter system. And this was the largest number of families in the Bronx from one community to be entering the shelter system.
You can see that's that orange number 1
Yes.
below the 428.
Exactly, and the third highest in New York City overall. And one thing again that's just striking about the Bronx is that 7 of the top 10 communities in terms of the largest number of families entering the shelter system were all in the Bronx.
Sorry,
So-
that's my immediate reaction. The one thing I want to ask about that graphic, it looks like the number went down over during the period that was studied from fiscal year 2013 to 14.
Right.
Are we to be encouraged to that, or the number is so high that the 6% is not a big deal?
So I wish I could say we should be encouraged,
Good try.
but I think that's one of the reasons why multiple indicators are important, because in this profile, if you were to look at the student numbers or the number of students who are homeless in that same community district, what you would see is a very large increase in the number of students who are homeless. So that sort of gives you a sense of, while you might not be seeing that increase in the shelter system yet, you're seeing that in the number of doubled up students who are in the community.
And then on the right side, I really want to point this out. And this is, again, available in every one of the districts. And it varies from district to district. But people who are watching may say, well, wait a minute, why are all these people in this circumstance? And here we have 23% because of domestic violence, 15% for overcrowding, 12% for immediate return. I guess then they're kind of recycled back in. But the largest number is eviction, and that gets into the housing stock and available housing, which many people, of course, believe that is the bottom line for homelessness. Would you just address what we saw in that pie chart?
Sure. I think that pie chart is incredibly important for all of the community profiles, and in part because of what you just said, which is that the pie differs depending on which neighborhood you're looking at. And so that's a really important thing to think about when you're developing programs and trying to meet the needs of families who are entering the shelter system and those families who might be at risk. So in University Heights, the 38% of families that reported entering shelter due to eviction is incredibly high.
That's a huge number.
It is incredibly high, but it mirrors other indicators that you see as risk factors in the community that you could start looking at before maybe those numbers get so high. So 45%, almost half of all residents in that neighborhood are severely rent burdened, paying 50% or more of their income in rent.
Well, I'm just going to interject, so now you can do one of these to the guy next to you, because then it becomes his burden to say, well, wait a minute, I know that in this particular neighborhood, 23% of the people are homeless for domestic violence. That again is just, you say, well, 23%, now you're looking at 428, 23% is, I guess, just about 100 people. And that is an enormous number of people. And then the housing issues. So go ahead, Greg, solve my problems for me.
I'm not offering any solutions just yet, but
well, you're trying.
when you look at the level of evictions, you also have to ask how many of these evictions could have been prevented. When you go to housing court, a lot of times people are, before they even get into a courtroom, are talked out of their homes basically into some kind of settlement. And if they have representation or even just some advice from someone in a community-based organization on how to help prevent an eviction, what resources are out there, for example, from the Human Resources Administration to stop an eviction, it's a hell of a lot cheaper to stop an eviction by providing legal services than to try and rehouse a family in shelter. And more importantly, it's a lot more stable for the family to be able to stay in their home than to have to switch between shelter and then maybe a new apartment somewhere the other side of the city.
Yeah, people know that the words Bronx Housing Court is almost an obscenity, because it's a very difficult process to navigate. All right, let's see what we have next. What number do we have next? Let's put something up. What do we got? Okay, this is in Soundview, homelessness and poverty among all students. Housed low income is 69%. What are we seeing here?
So this is another indicator that I think is extremely helpful when thinking about the larger context of homelessness in a community. So what this looks like is, or it looks at, is the school data, and it breaks things out by the proportion of students who are homeless, the proportion of students who are low income, and then the proportion of students who are housed but not low income.
Excuse me, I should interject. We've now moved to a different neighborhood, and everybody knows that where Soundview is, more certainly toward the southeastern part of the Bronx. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
And so one of the reasons I think this is particularly interesting for Soundview is that unlike the pie chart that you would have seen for University Heights, where there actually were more homeless students in University Heights than there were housed students who are not low income, in Soundview you see the reverse. You see that there are 18% of students who are not low income and are housed, and 13% of students who are homeless. Now, what's interesting, though, is that Soundview still has one of the highest number of students who are homeless in the city, and also is sending one of the largest number of families to the shelter system.
So in analysis of that, taking that as fact, what do you then say, as whether you're an elected official or some other person in charge, or somebody like Greg Brender at UNH, what do you look at that and say, gee, we have to do what?
Well, I think the first thing is you look at it and say, wow, this doesn't make sense. What is going on here?
Right.
And then from there, you need to start looking at what are the other factors in this community. And what you see when you start looking more into Soundview is that there has been an incredible increase in the proportion of low-wage jobs over time. Poverty is increasing in the community. So there are risk factors that are really growing in the neighborhood, and there are not enough supports that are preventing families from entering the shelter system and from becoming homeless.
Let's do I think we have one more that we're going to show, and then we'll try and draw some sort of conclusions. Do we have that one more? Yeah, here it is. So now here we're looking at 380 number of families entering the shelter, and then you can see the borough and city ranks. What are your thoughts here, Mrs. Erb Downward?
Sure. So this is looking at Mott Haven, oh no, this is, sorry, I
Yeah,
can't.
it's still Union
No, this
Port
is Soundview, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
So this is Soundview, I couldn't quite see the screen. So again, this is looking at some of the other numbers that I was just saying, that this Soundview has the third highest rate of families entering the shelter in the Bronx, which is, surprising given the other pie chart that we just looked at a minute ago. And not only that, they have the sixth highest rate overall in all of New York City. So that is 380 families entering shelter in 1 year is really something that we need to start thinking about. If the dynamics that are underlying in the community right now are not addressed, more families are going to be entering the shelter system. Exactly.
All right, we only have a couple of moments left, so I'm going to give you each a chance to kind of summarize what we've seen. And as I mentioned to both of you before the show, we could review this and go on for hours because there is so much data, really good and interesting data, but it leads to so many questions about how we're operating our services in our society in the borough of the Bronx. Mr. Brender, let's just talk about homelessness prevention programs. Are these the kinds of things that can work? Are we on the way to solving it, or is the thing just morphing into something larger and larger?
For a lot of families, homelessness prevention programs are incredibly successful. They take, to some extent, which are simple solutions, finding people the support they need to stay in their homes. If sometimes it's a small grant from either a nonprofit or from the city,
Right.
but also providing the legal support to make sure that families who or individuals who are being wrongly evicted are not done.
It sounds like it's the whole wide range of things. I'm just going to give you the final word. What would you like to happen to people who are looking at this, and what quick, we only have about 15 seconds, result that would you like to see happen as a result of the work you did?
Sure. I think the biggest thing is that really to reinforce that we need to start thinking about homelessness as a children's issue. The long-term impact that we see homelessness having on a child's education and development is just astronomical.
And that really is our future.
Yes, exactly.
Jennifer Erb Downward from ICPH, thank you so much for the great work you do. And Gregory Brender, say hello to all my friends at UNH.
Of course.
And thank you and all the great work that you folks really do in saving our families in the Bronx and in the city of New York. We appreciate it. Folks, if you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org or put them on our Facebook page, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. We ask you to like the Bronx Talk Facebook page. You can check out our archives at BronxNet.org. You'll find Bronx Talk on the lower right navigation bar. We thank our producer, Jayla. Our director is Brianna. And guess what? We'll see you next week. It's true. Good night. Happy holidays. Did we say happy holidays? Happy holidays, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay there. They're going to roll the credits.